Hello and welcome to Nourish. My name is Kasha and I'm an entrepreneur, longtime meditator, and student of Chinese medicine. On this podcast, I share the stories and tools from Type A high achievers who have discovered that elusive state of balance between success and interconnection, purpose, and awareness. Think yin and yang in flow, because hustling without balance just leads to burnout. My hope is that this podcast offers you inspiration and tools to help you cultivate your best life. Now let's jump into it. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Nourish podcast. I'm your host, Kasha, and I am just wrapping up a super nourishing Qigong practice with my next guest, Jim Gallas. Jim is such an exceptional teacher. He has taught yoga for 32 years, Shiatsu, Reiki, anatomy. And on today's episode, we're going to dive into a very pertinent practice for this podcast, which is Qigong, deeply rooted in the principles of Chinese medicine. We dive into it all. The benefits of Qigong, the particular style that Jim teaches, how Qigong has evolved, what is the difference between Qigong and other meditative practices, and also movement practices such as yoga. I am so excited about this podcast episode because we spend a lot of time talking about recognizing disease in the body, healing disease, preventing it. And a lot of the things that we talk about are really rooted in Chinese medicine, acupuncture, herbs, meditation, perhaps other therapeutic practices. And Qigong is really a medicine for and of the people, which is something that Jim coined on this podcast, and I absolutely love. And I'm so excited to share this with you today to give you the tools to really start to heal yourself and prevent disease for the future. This podcast is super juicy, and be sure to check out the show notes because on this episode, after the recording, Jim and I actually went through a couple of really quick and sweet short practices that you can incorporate into your day-to-day life as well. I am so excited to introduce this next guest, and without further ado, let's welcome Jim to the Nourish podcast. Jim, finally dialing in from Mexico, right?
That's right.
Welcome to the Nourish podcast. I'm so excited to have you on as a guest.
And I'm honored. Thank you for the invite.
We have a lot to get into, and I'm so excited to talk about all of the principles of Reiki, Shiatsu, Qigong, which is really going to be the main theme that we're going to talk about here. I have a lot of questions in that whole realm, but before we do that, I want to kick it off with a question that I ask each and every guest, and that is, what are 3 words that you would use to describe yourself?
Celebratory and in search. I could keep going. How about wonder?
Wow, I love that. I love that. And I think it's so great to hear these words because, you and I, we have never really met in person, face to face. And so getting these descriptors really helps give a feel for who you are as a practitioner, as a person. And I have to say, those words are very joyous. So thank you for kicking us off with that.
Please.
Amazing. So you are such a multifaceted teacher. You've taught yoga for 32 years, Shiatsu, Reiki. You're I don't know what word to use, wizard of anatomy. I'm going to throw that in there. My words, not yours. So I'll put that in there myself. But a really exciting topic that I really want to dive into, which is very pertinent for this podcast, is that you are a practitioner and teacher of Qigong. And I'm so excited to dive into all of the principles of Qigong, the history, and all that good stuff, because, a lot of what we talk about on this podcast is how to come back into balance in a holistic way. And how can we give our listeners not just information about, what are the signs of different diseases and how can you support yourself with herbs and acupuncture and meditation and all of that good stuff, but also what are some of the lifestyle practices that you can bring into your life to really support you along the way. So I want to start with the overarching question. For a lot of people listening, the term Qigong may be one that they've heard, but they are not familiar with it. Can you define for us exactly what is Qigong? Is it a practice? Is it a martial art? Tell us.
I would love to define that. The definition that of course, there's books written on it that you could take chapters written on Qigong, but the definition that I prefer to use, Qi is life force. We find life force in all things, not even just what we consider animate, but even inanimate forms have life force, Qi. In yoga, we call it prana. The Polynesians call it mana. The Japanese call it ki. So very similar, all really analogous terms. The literal translation of gong is work, but the one that I prefer is cultivating. So we're cultivating something that's already there. There's an essential energy that's already there, and we can work it and free it and open the flow of that qi. And that's what Qigong, in its most succinct definition, I like to use: cultivating life force.
That is so beautiful. And I'm really excited to learn more about some of the history behind this, because we talk a lot about Qi on this podcast, of course, because we have a lot of great experts in the field of Chinese medicine. And one of the things that I think for myself as a student of Chinese medicine that almost feel a bit, what's the term? As though I feel disempowered to take healing into my own hands, because very frequently, unless we're talking about things like herbs or really acupuncture, there's this big question around how do you cultivate more qi or more harmony in the body? And it sounds like Qigong can be one of the ways that you can do that, if I'm hearing your definition correctly.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, it can come in really small increments as well, too. If you do 10 minutes of Qigong a day, you'll start to experience benefits just from that simple practice. And it really is, as you say, it really is the practice of the people. Anybody can do it. I've taught people in wheelchairs. I've taught people with major disabilities. So it's really available to anybody. It has a lot of different expressions. We can talk a little bit about the different manifestations of Qigong, but it can be a daily practice. You don't need any materials. It's wonderful done outside. You can practice indoors. So it is available to everybody. That's one of the things I love about it. It's really people's medicine, if you will. The balance for the people, harmony for the people.
I love that. So let's actually dive into some of the benefits. What are some of the benefits of cultivating life force or Qigong?
Good. Well, let's just take a little sidestep and say there are many, many forms of Qigong. I teach one in particular, and I've added other aspects to it, which we'll talk a little bit more about when you get into specifics. But my friend Lee Holden, who's a well-known Qigong teacher, talks about the possibility of 3,000 forms of Qigong. Kenneth Cohen's book that I'd recommend to everybody, The Way of Qi, is he talks about the possibility of 10,000 forms of Qigong. It's hard to know. Some of them were just practiced within certain families and held as secret information and held as a lineage just for a particular extended family. There are others that are much more widely practiced, but it's really the form that I teach. I can speak a little bit more specifically to about the benefits. It's the form that I teach is called Wai Dan Gong, which in itself has a number of expressions. It is translated in different ways. It's spelled W-A-I. My Chinese, by the way, is horrible. I have a good Chinese friend who, of course, it's tonal.
My Chinese is horrible as well. So we can stick to the horrible version together.
Good. But he often says, when I say why, it means crooked. It's meant to mean external or outside. So, and I like to think of it as the greater, the earth and the heavens. Dan refers to the lower dantian, which is another way to say your center. It's where we aim to practice from, about 1.5 inches below our navel, a couple inches into the body. It has references in many spiritual traditions, including yoga, Sufism. The Japanese call it the hara. Yogis call it the kanda. The Sufis call it the kath. It's the center between heaven and earth. So it really has a profound place in your body. And it makes us move in a different way if we drop our awareness and move from our center. In Chinese, we call it the lower dantian. So back to the name of Wai Dan Gong, it's the greater, the larger, that can be focused into your lower dantian, which in Chinese medicine is really where our batteries are, is the way I like to think of it, where storage are. It relates to the kidneys. The kidneys have what's called primordial qi or ancestral qi. I traveled in China many years ago, and I really recognized how they revere the kidneys. I was there in the winter, and a lot of places they would sell kidney belts just to protect the qi of the kidneys. And that relates to this lower dantian we're talking about, this center. And so the Wai Dan Gong in its fullest expression is opening to heaven and earth so we can fuel the body and the mind and the heart with the energies of the greater, of heaven and earth. So we're opening the channels so that there can be a nice free flow of energy from heaven to earth, back and forth, and that fluid, open, energetic field is created.
So and by the way, thank you for that detailed explanation. I have a ton of follow-up questions, but in terms of, let's start with some of the benefits that show up for people who practice this form of Qigong. What are, when you talk about having that free flow of energy, how does that typically translate? Is it just, let's say emotional ease? Is it, fewer achy joints and pains? Like, what are some of the benefits that you've noticed maybe in your own life or with the people that you teach that show up through practicing this form of Qigong regularly?
Yeah, it's a very practical question. I love it. What does it do for you? How does it work? So I'd say the first thing it works on multiple levels, which is one of the joys of teaching and practicing. On the physical level, just getting the body moving. This is essential, especially as we get older. I work with a lot of seniors, a lot of people that are approaching senior ages, just simply keeping the body moving, keeping the joints lubricated. So on a physical anatomical level, it helps produce synovial fluid, which is the nutrients and lubrication for our joints. It helps keep the tendons lengthened. As we age and even if we're not nearly as old, but if we're sedentary, a lot of people spend a lot of time in chairs these days. It helps us reverse patterns that we create by oversitting and overslumping in particular. So it's good posturally. I always like to relate the posture to the breath. The breath and the posture are like heads and tails of a coin. If we find ourselves sitting, standing, walking in good posture, we're inevitably going to breathe better. If we breathe better, if we just pause and take a deeper breath, we're going to lengthen the spine. We're going to open the chest a little bit more. So Qigong definitely helps better breath, which is a direct link to the mind. If we breathe better, we start to settle into what's known as relaxation response, where the blood pressure goes down, the heart rate goes down, the good hormones go up, the more challenging hormones like cortisol and adrenaline, which are very important and needed when we need to go and fight and flight. But in the culture that we live in these days, we spend way too much time in that side of our autonomic nervous system. So it helps us settle into the place that we really should be most of the time in relaxation response. So on that level, it works really well. And on a deeper and deeper level, on the spiritual level, we start to feel energy in our bodies. We have the experience of qi. It's not just a mental thought or concept. We actually start to feel, they're holding my hands this way gives me the sensation of qi running between my fingers. Or after this movement, I feel qi dropping down in my body a little bit more. So it's really, again, in relationship to your question that I love so much, the practical aspects of Qigong are that you actually experience these things. It's not just the conceptual. Even after a short time, you can start to feel, I'm more relaxed. That simple one practice, that two practice, three practice, that 10 minutes a day, oh, I'm starting my day in a frame of mind that's going to put me in a much better setup for the entire day. So it works on multiple levels, really is the simplest answer. Body, mind, spirit, emotional body, all are benefited by the practice.
I love that. And I love that you called out actually being able to experience the sensations of chi flowing through your body. Because one of the things, and as I was preparing for this interview, I was reading some research around, stress and how when you are in that state of fight or flight and not in that soothed, like parasympathetic, really relaxed state, you do generally start to feel like that detachment from your body. And for a lot of people, especially for most of us sitting in front of our computers all day, we're up here, we're in our heads, and
Correct.
rooting down to feeling sensations in your body, which then helps us recognize even things like, are we hungry right now? Or are we, just reacting impulsively because we want to eat emotionally? Or do we feel stress? A lot of people actually struggle with being able to recognize those emotions in their body, which in Chinese medicine, as you, I'm sure know, like are associated with diseases. So I love that you mentioned how Qigong helps cultivate that mind-body connection.
Yeah. And I'd love to speak to that. I've been in this wonderful holistic healing game for over 30 years now. And for years, I taught anatomy in a massage school and would bring in, oh, it's interesting. AMA now acknowledges that 50% of disease is related to stress. And over the years, it's gone up to over 90%. The AMA itself, this is not a holistic body, that will say over 90% of disease is stress related. We may have the preconditions, but those preconditions will have a good chance of remaining dormant if we really live in the world in the relaxation response. Of course, there are appropriate times for us to rise up, the blood pressure to go up, the everything to kick in and respond appropriately. And then as soon as possible, we drop back into the relaxation response. So that is one of the huge benefits. And that is multi-level too. Just being in that state supports the body, supports the emotional balance, supports ultimately opening to the larger, which is the biggest picture of Qigong, opening to what the Taoists call source or the Tao. So Qigong can help take us there.
Oh boy. And I definitely want to dive into that. But before we do, I do want to leave our listeners with a little bit of background and history. So can you share, how did Qigong evolve I know it has roots in China and really where did it come from? Like this practice. I'm so fascinated by it. And I'm sure folks may be wondering the same. You mentioned that there are like anywhere from 3,000 to like 10,000 forms or styles of Qigong. How did Qigong come about?
Well, it's hard to say exactly, but most practitioners and teachers feel it started as long as 5,000 years ago. Some people feel it came from the Chinese shamans that would act out and do dances mirroring animal spirits and nature spirits. And the ancient Chinese shamans would use those dances and those practices for healing, for clearing energy even within a village. If they felt there was some negative overhanging energy of a village, they would do a particular practice and so forth. So some feel that Qigong grew out of that, of ancient shamanic traditions of China and even Tibet and other parts of the region. Other people talk about the ancient Chinese farmers doing practices just to help their body, and they would start again mirroring nature. They would play with the sensations of the wind and watch the grains moving in the breeze. They would watch the different animals and do different movements from the animals and so forth. And then as time went on, people would start to realize, especially the deeper Taoist practitioners, the classic Taoist spiritual practitioner is one that leaves humanity, at least for a time, goes into the mountains, sits in meditation, and then would start feeling the need to keep the body fluid and open and able to sit in good posture, these Taoist monks, we can call them, would start moving and be, again, inspired by nature, the movement of water in particular, the movement of the clouds, the way a deer would move through the forest, the way a tree stands steadily, and so forth and so on. So also, Qigong may well have been cultivated through the more monastic tradition. There's also, as we go through, there's a revered monk named Bodhidharma. This is much later. This is now we're moving much later into history, that may well have brought some of the yogic tradition from India through when he was bringing Buddhism in more fully into China. So there's another aspect. It probably started with Taoism, but it may well also be influenced by Buddhist practices and even yogic practices. Some of the yogic breathing practices have become breathing practices that are used in Qigong and used slightly differently because the body is understood a little bit differently in an Ayurvedic practitioner, which of course is the medical practice of India, as compared to traditional Chinese medicine. And then on it goes. There's a much longer history. I would suggest Kenneth Cohen's book for those that are really interested. I think it's a wonderful foundational text. And then it even changed again much more recently during the Cultural Revolution, when things like Qigong were really quashed, until the powers that be started to realize, oh, this was actually really good for this population. And we can still hold this incredible amount of power, and people are not a threat just in the fact that they do Qigong. So it's really interesting. That's really a bit of a side topic and come bring us almost to current day. But even in communist China now, they're allowing and starting to even encourage more Qigong practices. They're hoping that they remain very secular, but they're even allowing some of the more traditional spirituality back, realizing that it really serves the masses in multiple ways, on multiple levels of health. So that was a long stretch from 5,000 years ago to today, and there's a lot in there that's left to be spoken, but that gives us a little bit of idea anyway.
Absolutely. And I love that you started to share a bit about the kind of, I guess, intertwined histories between China and India, and how some of these practices have maybe not completely shared roots, but that there is kind of this connection there. And I think it's so fascinating because you've taught yoga for over 32 years. What is the difference between some of the yogic principles and some of the yogic movement versus Qigong? And is there really, I mean, I know that obviously the movements are different, but in terms of either the benefits or, and this can even be from like your personal experience. If you have somebody, because I was researching, and I'll just share a little bit of background before I go back to the question, but have you heard of the book, The Body Keeps the Score?
I've heard of it and I have not read it.
Okay. It's a really good book on trauma and how trauma is really held in the body and the ways to move trauma. And there's a whole chapter dedicated to yoga and how yoga, really does help move trauma throughout the body and like that form of movement and breath work. And, it kind of sent me down this rabbit hole, and I'll deep link, of course, in the show notes, all of this for our listeners as well. But there's a lot of research that shows how yoga and Qigong and, of course, breath work, meditation even translates now to Western therapeutics, such as, it increases heart rate variability, which has been shown to decrease stress, as you mentioned. So we have that whole translation. And I'm curious for you, as a teacher and practitioner of both, do you choose one practice over the other if you're feeling a certain way? Do you practice both? What are some of the similarities and really the maybe more so the differences between these two practices, which I know share some overlap and have similar benefits in many ways?
Great question. Again, extensive possibilities in the answer. I'd like to start with a common point. And in the last book that BKS Iyengar wrote, Iyengar was known as the Lion of Yoga. He's the yoga teacher that introduced props. He's really the one of the first teachers to really get really specific alignment work. And his last book, he was really an hard ass, I can say, and he sweetened as he got older, which is wonderful. That's part of the process in both yoga and Chinese medicine and Qigong, is that there can be wisdom that comes with aging and so forth. And he definitely embodied that in his last book called Light on Life. He wrote a number of seminal books. But I just stood up and applauded when I read the passage that said, we're energy fields from heaven to earth, which is the most basic foundational principle of Chinese medicine. We're conduits of energy, meridian lines. In Sanskrit, they call them nadis, the energy channels. They're quite different, though it's interesting enough. In Chinese medicine, we have 14 main channels, if you include the 2 central channels. Even though in Ayurveda they have as many as 10,000 channels again, which is hard to get a grasp on, there are 14 main channels. They're different. They're quite different. But there's a similarity there. They both honor that there is an energetic body. And that, I think those are their most common, that there's an energetic body that underlies this physical body. So in terms of how they're different, at least the way that I experience how they're different, for me, the yoga that I practice works on a deep structural level. It really, for example, you stand in a balancing pose for some time and you sustain. I do a slower form of yoga. I previously taught vinyasa, but for me, I like to really slow it down, breathe slow and deep, and really get a deep focus. That's what works for me, and so forth. So in my experience, there's a structural thing that happens in yoga. And it really moves through the muscles, bones, and tissues. And the breath is very prescribed often. We really want to slow down the breath. Of course, there's the science of the breath in yoga called pranayama. So it expresses itself in those held postures. And in doing so, the body gets stronger. And ultimately, the mind gets stronger as well, too. The mind gets more flexible and more stable when we really do a good practice. Qigong, at least the form that I teach, again, a lot of the benefits are the same, but they come about in a slightly different way. In Qigong, as we already mentioned, it works on the physical level. The practice that I teach, we usually do rounds of movement. So this particular form loves 9, as a lot of people in Chinese do. It's 3 rounds of 3. It's thought to be a number of completion. So we usually either do a practice 3 times or 9 times, or 9 times on each side if it's a bilateral practice. I'm thinking of a particular swinging arms towards heaven, and we do it 9 times on each side. So it's a repeated practice, quite different than yoga in that way. In my experience, again, I'll say, Qigong and this form of Qigong tends to move directly to the energy body. You feel the sensation of qi or prana quite quickly in this form. In the type of yoga, again, there's so many expressions of yoga and so many expressions of Qigong. People's experiences can be different on both ends. But the type of yoga that I teach, ultimately, by the time, if you do a nice full practice of an hour and a half, you lie down in Shavasana, which is corpse pose at the end, you could definitely often feel a pulsation of energy in your body. So there we are. We end up at a place. In Qigong, this form of Qigong, again, I have to keep referencing that. This form of Qigong, you can often feel Qi in a 10-minute practice, which is not to say one's better than the other, but that's my experience of the difference, the repeated number of times that we do a practice. And one of the joys of repeating things, and I always remind my students in Qigong, that no force. It's really one of the most foundational principles of Taoism. It's called Wu Wei, the water course way. Move like water. So I always give them the reminder, since we have 9 rounds, we're going to do this, maybe let it build up. If it's a back-bending practice, take it really easy the first round, 2, and then just feel how, okay, you become a little bit more supple just in doing a number of the practice. So there's probably other ways but those are the things that come to mind of how they're different and how they're the same.
I think that was very well explained. And when you started to talk about the sensation of qi, I was like, okay, that immediately I can relate to that in practicing, maybe not exactly your form of Qigong, which I'm so excited to try. And we're going to teaser for anybody listening to this to check out the show notes, because I'm going to link some short practices that Jim is going to walk us through in a bit. But I've definitely had that experience where I have practiced other forms of Qigong and actually really felt that chi sensation, which I think that's such an interesting differentiator. So something that I'm curious about, and I'm going to have two follow-up questions to that. There is an aspect of almost like a meditative quality to Qigong in my experience. What are your thoughts on, as you kind of imagine balancing all the things you want to do to have a healthy body and a healthy mind? Do you feel that Qigong is a replacement in a way for a meditative practice? I know that there are some overlaps in quality. This is more of like your experience as a teacher, but what are your thoughts on that? Like, it is meditative in nature, but is it something that is a supplement to, could be a replacement for? What are your thoughts about that?
Another wonderful question. Thank you. Yes, it's a meditative practice. The form that I teach is Wai Dan Gong. Again, tends to be often thought as a physical practice. Qigong is often thought to be more the internal practices. An example of that would be the microcosmic orbit meditation practice, where you consciously circulate energy, and in the simplest form, which I do, is through the central channels with the mind and with the breath. I'll give you a little aside to that I think is really important. My main Qigong teacher, I've studied with a number of them, is a woman named Chunan Lai. And I always say, if I only remembered one thing from Chunan, it would be where the mind goes, the energy goes, which is really profound, because think about our day, think about our mind. Our minds are powerful. They're very powerful. And yet, how often are we truly fully present? So the Qigong as a practice can really help us come into the present moment. And that's there's physical responses to that. There's emotional responses to that. There's energetic responses, and that's a spiritual practice. And that is true meditation, is just coming present in this moment here and now. So the form that I do is a fairly yang form, meaning there's a lot of moving, a lot of shaking, a lot of big steps and so forth like that. Some Qigong practices, really, you wouldn't tell the difference between sitting meditation and that particular Qigong practice. It's an internal practice that you're working with. That being said, when I teach, I like to teach an hour and 15 minutes. When I do the form that I teach can fairly easily be done in 45 minutes or less. But I like to spread it out to an hour and 15 minutes. I do some preliminary meridian stretches, some self-massage, which opens the energy channels as well. And then at the end, we do both a standing meditation, which some people consider the grandmother of Qigong. And we also finish with a sitting meditation. Of just standing meditation, usually about 5 minutes, something like that. Sitting meditation, about 5 minutes. Certainly with the possibility that people can finish the class and sit longer if they choose to, if that works for them. The particular form of Qigong that I teach, again, Wai Dan Gong, I feel is a wonderful preliminary to your meditation practice. So I often will do 10 minutes of Qigong before I sit in the morning. And then I do my yoga practice after that. It's nice to have the leisure to set up your schedule. I really set up my schedule now, so I have a fairly extensive time in the morning to have long cups of tea and a lot of meditation time, and time for some Qigong, time for some yoga, and some good food and all that before I even start teaching. So that's a leisurely way that I've been able to set up my life. But I think that, yes, Qigong can be actually a movement meditation. And yes, also, Qigong can set us up for sitting meditation or any meditative practice really well.
By the way, that was such a perfect segue into my next question, which is, I'm sure everybody here listening is thinking, first of all, your morning sounds so amazing. And I think there's something to be said to working to prioritize that. I myself make sure that I'm meditating every morning, that I have some time to slow down at least I try to before I get rolling. So I think that's a really good shout out to morning routines. But I wanted to ask you, as you kind of imagine, and maybe you can recommend this for people depending on the phases of life that they're in, how would you recommend people structure their mornings? Especially like you have a lot of fast-paced, busy students who are now like, okay, I need to get a workout in. I want to meditate. I now want to fit Qigong into my day because it sounds like it's a great thing. What is kind of, if for the fast-paced person who maybe is like just trying to structure a not necessarily realistic, this can be adjusted for every single person, but somebody who doesn't have maybe as much time, how would you recommend that they fit these different practices into their days, especially since you are both a yoga teacher and a Qigong teacher, and sounds like you're a meditator and you have deep knowledge of this medicine and this method? What would a breakdown look like for folks?
Well, a key aspect of Qigong is really interesting. And again, it feels like a little aside, but we'll bring it right back in, is get enough rest. So that's one of the real challenges of our modern culture. We don't even value rest. One of my early yoga teachers, wonderful woman named Judith Lassiter, that really got restorative yoga going, used to call our practice the lost art of rest. Of just doing restorative yoga. So yes, we live in a fast-paced life. Yeah, but there is a certain level of, as you use the word, prioritize, that we have to go, okay, my health is essential. And again, health on multiple levels: physical health, my emotional health, and ultimately my spiritual unfolding. And all of those happen simultaneously. So I would say, to start with, is getting enough sleep. And that's a big challenge for a lot of us. I'm not a great sleeper, but I do my practices to help support that. Even when I wake up, I do practice. When I wake up at night, you can do practices. I do mantra practice and I do breath practices, both yogic and Qigong breath practices when I wake up. So that sets you up for a morning that you can get up just a little bit earlier. If you're getting up at 7:30 to get to work at 8:30, maybe you can get up at 7:15 and do some preliminary practices. Some of the easiest Qigong is just standing up. I'll show it to you later, and just moving your arms side to side and breathing with that. Simply doing that. I'll tell you the way that I structure my morning and try and be fairly succinct on this. I get up. I won't be too graphic. I go to the bathroom. I take care of that. I come out and I clean my space as the tea water is boiling. So I read this years ago in a book called Tao In, which is self-practice. So just to clearing my space enough, if I've thrown a shirt over the table or whatever, I put it away. And I live in a very small space. I live in a little cottage. And so I tidy things up just in 2 or 3 minutes. Just put things in order. Have my cup of tea, do about 10 minutes of Qigong, and sit and meditate. But if you only had 5 minutes for Qigong and you could sit for 5 minutes, that will set your day up in a really good way. I love Eckhart Tolle, a teacher that wrote The Power of Now. Meditation can happen in one single conscious breath. So just to slow down, I think one of the most personally diabolical lifestyles is for the alarm to go off. You jump out of bed, you have the minimal time to go, jump out of bed, have your cup of coffee, get into traffic. We got to do better. I'm sorry than that. We just have to find a little bit more time to set our day. And even that simple thing of intention. I have friends that wake up, the first thing they do, it's going to be a great day, is their mantra. It's going to, even before they get out of bed. I actually do practice before I even get out of bed. I often start, this is more Reiki, but it's really Qigong, a hand on my lower belly, a hand over my heart, and take a few breaths before I even roll out of bed. Even roll out of bread. How about that? I love slips like that. I have a whole book of slips when I'm teaching yoga, when I screw up. But anyway, I would say just giving yourself a little slice of time. Start with 10 minutes in the morning. And maybe it's 3 minutes of Qigong. And you sit and breathe, and maybe it's your favorite stretch. That's a whole lot better than none at all. That's infinitely better in a lot of ways. I also think a wonderful time to practice is when we get home from work. If you're on that work scale, and especially in your community, a lot more people are working at home. But instead of having your couple of cocktails, think about having a Qigong or a yoga cocktail. Have something nice to drink, whatever. I wouldn't use alcohol before any of the practices personally. I like having a good beer occasionally, a good glass of wine. That's nice, but they're separate. But it can be a really nice thing to do before you have dinner. Just do a little bit of really calming Qigong, relaxing, wonderful before you go to bed. Take 5 minutes to slow down your breath, or to do the microcosmic orbit, which is a really simple breath practice that you circulate energy in the body. So your practice should vary a little bit depending on the time of the day when you're doing it. You obviously want to do a much more energetic practice or in the morning, and a much more calming practice if you can do something before you go to bed. I also love, people are getting much better at this from what I'm seeing, especially in the corporate world, of people taking their breaks as something that it's supportive of their health. So they get outside, they walk. You could easily do a 2-minute Qigong practice on your 15-minute break at work. Or if you have a longer lunch break, get out, walk, take 5 minutes under the trees, and just do something really simple. Little increments are amazing, because once you start having the experience, you'll say, I want more of this. I want to feel like this more often. I want to feel better on a daily basis. And then it just works that way. It just starts to cultivate that way.
I love that. And I feel like this explanation just melded so well with the quote that you uttered a little bit earlier, which is, where the mind goes, energy flows. So I think that theme of intention is just so important. And I love some of the really tangible and accessible tips that you shared. Jim, I could keep chatting with you for forever, but I know we're running up on time here. So I do want to have you share with the audience, where can people find you? Do you have classes going on? I think this has been such a beautiful introduction into Qigong. And
good. Yeah, I'd love to share that. First of all, my web page is www.relaxedfocus.net, RELAXED I'm currently teaching 3 online classes, 2 yoga classes and 1 Qigong class. And I do teach privates online if people choose to do it that way. Those are listed on my webpage. You can also feel free with any questions. I love this interview, by the way. Thank you. You have some great questions. We can do another one if you ever want. I'd love to do it again. And if anybody has any follow-up questions, feel free to get in touch with me by email, jim@relaxedfocus.net again. So happy to talk to you there. And then I'll say a few things about the workshops I have coming up. The next one is here in Mexico. It's the second week in March. It's called Long Spine Spacious Mind. It is both yoga, and I'm starting to play more with teaching yoga and Qigong in the same workshop and getting good response from that. We also do some meditation. We do some silent walking in the jungle. We go to some remote beaches and practice Qigong on beautiful tropical beaches. And that is listed on my website. Again, Long Spine Spacious Mind. I have the great joy of teaching 4 workshops next year at Esalen Institute, which is, if you haven't been there, I highly recommend going there. It's on the Big Sur coast in California. It's been going for almost 60 years now, and it's an amazing place, great food, beautiful setting. In June, I teach a workshop called Vibrant Silence, and that speaks directly to one of the questions that you ask about meditation and Qigong. We practice Qigong outside looking at the ocean, and then we come back into a beautiful yurt and practice sitting meditation and get people to then share their experiences of what it is like to meditate after practicing Qigong. We also have a half day of silence. So it's really nice. A lot of people haven't spent a lot of time in silence. I believe all spiritual traditions grow from silence, that awareness of being still and moving inwards, so that it gives people that ability to actually start to experience some silent meditation time and do some walking meditation and so forth. Later in the summer, in August, I teach a thing called The Wisdom of Aging, and that is a yoga workshop. I taught that last year at Esalen. It was very well received, and you have to show your ID to get in. You have to be at least 50 years old. We're not excluding it. I love teaching young people, but I just felt in dialogue with the folks at Esalen, we feel there's a need to keep welcoming people as they're aging and really honoring the wisdom that can come with aging and get in supportive groups, because we're such a youth-oriented culture. And in ways, yoga and a lot of fitness has been co-opted by youth culture because it's commercially viable that way. It makes the most money. But we get together and we actually talk about, okay, what is it like to age as yogis, as people that practice yoga, as people that are embodied? What are the challenges? What is the wisdom that's coming? How do we support each other? How do we create community, spiritual and elder community? So that's part of that workshop. And then in October, beginning of October, I teach a workshop that's just an absolute joy called Wild Tao. I co-teach that with a wonderful teacher named Fletcher Tucker. He has his own group with his wife and a few other people called Wild Tender, and they work with meditative practices in nature. And also, this one is focused with Taoism, so we pair with Chinese medicine and Chinese medical principles, and we do Qigong before we leave Esalen's campus. Then we go out for hikes and we do Qigong in nature. We find beautiful places by streams and in the redwoods and so forth and practice Qigong outdoors. So that's in the second week of October. And then I teach a month-long course for those that would like to come to Esalen and work some, and it's less expensive that way. You stay at Esalen for a month, called Streams of Energy, which I've taught. This will be my 17th month long, I think, at Esalen. And that includes that's pretty much for people that want to do hands-on healing with either just their loved ones or start to cultivate that as a possibility for professional use. You learn a full Shiatsu sequence. You are certified in Reiki 1, which is the hands-on healing. You learn the entire Qigong form that I teach. We do some meditation, we dance, and we laugh, and we play. And so that's a month-long course. Next year, that starts on October 21st. So that will be in the Esalen catalog as well. I could go on and on. I teach a workshop in Mount Shasta that we do Qigong right underneath the mountain in a beautiful little town called McLeod. That's in June. That will also be on my website. And if it's not, email me, because I'm just getting these things up. And then I also, for years and years, I've taught at a beautiful place in the Sierra Mountains called Sierra Hot Springs. And that's primarily a yoga workshop, but there was a call. A lot of people wanted to learn some Qigong. So we went out and did Qigong in the pines and looked out at the huge meadow, that beautiful setting. So I love to teach in beautiful places. I'd love to have you join me in beautiful places. So those will all be available on my website. And thank you so much for asking.
Oh my gosh. All of those sound amazing. Even the wisdom of aging. I feel like I know that there's a age cutoff, but I love, changing up the narrative away from, some of this youth oriented culture. Like, there's one of the beautiful things that actually Chinese medicine has started to surface within me is recognizing that like every stage of life is beautiful. So I love that you called that out, and all of those workshops sound so amazing. I cannot wait to check them out myself personally. And I hope to see or meet some of you listeners there as well. Jim, this was absolutely amazing. Thank you so, so much for sharing your wisdom with us. I'm going to hyperlink all the resources that you shared in the show notes below. So folks, definitely check that out and head over to my social platforms and Jim's social platforms, which we will also link for some of the awesome little practices that we're going to be sharing with you, which we're going to kick off now. So thanks everyone for listening. And thank you, Jim, for joining.
Thanks a million. It was an absolute joy. I hope to meet all of you soon.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Nourish. If you enjoyed this conversation, please consider leaving a review or sharing it with a friend. Reviews really help this podcast grow and reach a larger audience, and I'm so grateful for that. I publish new episodes twice a month, so hit the subscribe button to be notified. See you next time.